The days after that night moved in a strange blur. I went through the motions, woke up, went to school, came home, but it all felt distant, like I was walking through a dream that wasn't mine. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow seemed longer, and no matter how hard I tried to forget, my mind kept replaying that night over and over again. The pale creature's glowing red eyes, the black-furred beast that saved me, the way the woods had seemed to breathe with something ancient and unseen. At school, things were worse. Curtis, Donnie, and Malik wouldn't shut up about how I'd chickened out at the tracks. They said they saw me run back before even crossing, called me scared and weak, their laughter trailing behind me like a mocking echo. I wanted to tell them the truth, wanted to say that I'd seen something out there, something that nearly killed me. But every time I opened my mouth, the words died on my lips. They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. The shadows in the woods, though, they were real. I could feel it. And they knew me now. One afternoon, about a week after it happened, I was sitting in the school library, pretending to read a book I hadn't even bothered to check the title of. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the quiet shuffling of students flipping through textbooks. It was peaceful, but not for me. My eyes drifted over the words on the page, but all I could see in my mind were those red eyes, the teeth, the feeling of being hunted. Every time I blinked, I saw the creature's face, inches from mine, grinning with hunger. I hadn't slept well since that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside my window made me jump. I knew, somehow, that thing was still out there. You've seen them, haven't you? The voice came out of nowhere, low, smooth, and soft enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked up from the book slowly, heart pounding in my chest, and found myself staring into the eyes of a man I'd never seen before. He stood at the end of the aisle, tall and lean, with skin the color of dark mahogany. He wore a neatly pressed suit, old-fashioned but clean, and carried a worn leather briefcase in one hand. His eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, like he could see more than what was in front of him. But it was his presence that unnerved me the most. There was something about him that felt off, like he wasn't supposed to be there, like he had walked in from some other place, some other reality, and I was the only one who noticed. "What?" I asked, my voice weak and shaky. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of panic in my chest. "You've seen the things that live in the dark," he said, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something cold. "The creatures that most people will never know exist." I stood up, knocking my chair back in the process. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Mr. Bowmont," he said, setting the briefcase down on the table in front of me with a soft thud. "And I think you and I need to have a conversation." I glanced around the library, hoping someone else might notice the strange man talking to me, but no one even looked up. It was like we were in our own little bubble, separated from the rest of the world. The quiet of the library pressed in around us, and I felt trapped, like there was no way out of whatever this conversation was going to be. "I don't know what you're talking about," I muttered, already backing away. Mr. Beaumont's eyes never left mine. "I think you do." There was no menace in his voice, but there didn't need to be. Something about the way he spoke made it clear that he wasn't asking. He knew. I stopped, staring at him. "How do you—" He cut me off before I could finish the question. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. I know because I've seen them too." I felt my throat tighten, my palms slick with sweat. "Seen what?" "The things that live in the shadows," he said, his voice dropping lower. "The creatures you encountered the other night, the ones that hunt from the darkness, that feed on fear and flesh. They're real, and you saw them. Now, they've seen you too." My pulse quickened, the weight of his words sinking into me like stones. How could he know? I hadn't told anyone what I'd seen, hadn't dared to speak of it. And yet, this man, this stranger, knew exactly what had happened. "What was it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The thing I saw, what was it? He studied me for a moment before answering, his gaze never wavering. It's called the hunger, one of many ancient things that walk this earth, hunting for prey. Once it marks you, it never forgets. A cold chill ran through me, settling deep in my bones. It was going to kill me. Yes, he said simply, and it still might. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to laugh, wanted to tell him that none of this was real, that it was just a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But deep down, I knew he was right. The hunger wasn't gone. It had only been driven off, and it was still out there, waiting. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice raw. What do you want? Mr. Bowmont reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. He placed it on the table between us and pushed it toward me. I'm telling you this because you're not like the others, he said. You saw it, and you survived. That means something. But survival isn't enough. If you want to stay alive, you're going to need help. I stared down at the journal, my hands trembling. Help? Mr. Bowmont nodded. There's a whole world out there that you don't understand yet. A world filled with things that would make your nightmares seem like sweet dreams. The hunger is just the beginning. And now that you've stepped into that world, the creatures in it can sense you. They'll come for you eventually. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I felt like a kid again, being told not to cross the train tracks. Except this time, I knew there was something waiting on the other side. What am I supposed to do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Bowmont leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. You learn, you fight, and you survive. Mr. Bowmont didn't give me much choice after that. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of training, lessons that were as terrifying as they were surreal. He taught me about the creatures of the night, the things that hunted in the dark corners of the world, unseen by most but dangerous all the same. He taught me about sigils, symbols etched into skin or metal that could ward off certain creatures. He showed me how to use salt and iron, things I'd thought were just myths, but that he wielded with deadly efficiency. Every day after school, we met in a small, run-down building at the edge of town, a place that looked abandoned, but felt alive with something old, something waiting. Mr. Bowmont would arrive with his briefcase, and we'd go over everything. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of the monsters that roamed the earth, everything from minor spirits to things far older, far more dangerous. I learned about the hunger first, the creature that had stalked me by the tracks. It wasn't just a beast. It was ancient, a predator that existed beyond time, one that hunted by marking its prey with fear. Once it chose you, it would follow you until it fed. The only way to escape it was to kill it first. The hunger is like a bloodhound, Mr. Bowmont had said one afternoon, his voice as calm as ever. It'll follow your scent until the day you die, or until you stop it. Stop it? I asked, not really wanting to know the answer. He gave me a grim smile. That's where I come in. The first time I held a weapon, it felt foreign in my hands. A simple iron blade, cold and heavy. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was enough. Bowmont made sure of that. We practiced in silence, his movements slow and deliberate, mine clumsy and uncoordinated. The blade was supposed to be my first line of defense, but I wasn't sure I could swing it with any real purpose. You'll need more than strength to survive out there, Bowmont said, watching me struggle with the weight of the weapon. It's about knowing what you're up against. Every creature has a weakness. You just need to find it. That's when he told me about silver, the most effective way to wound the ancient beasts, creatures like the hunger. Its bite was fatal to many, and Bowmont handed me a silver knife. The silver knife felt unnaturally cold in my hand, as if it held more than just metal in its polished blade. It glinted under the dim light of the run-down building where we trained, casting long, sharp shadows along the walls. I turned it over slowly, the weight feeling different from the iron blade, lighter, but somehow more deadly. Mr. Bowmont watched me closely, his eyes reflecting the knife's sheen. "Silver's not just for werewolves," he said, pacing slowly in front of me. "It's for anything old enough to fear it. The hunger's one of them. When the time comes, you'll need to strike fast. It's not going to give you a second chance." I nodded, though the idea of coming face to face with that thing again made my stomach churn. The hunger had already seen me, already marked me. But now, knowing it was still out there, knowing it was waiting, I felt a bone-deep chill that no amount of summer heat could burn away. "Is that how you stopped it?" I asked, gripping the knife a little tighter. Beaumont's expression darkened, his gaze far away for a moment. "There are worse things than the hunger. It's not always about stopping them, kid. Sometimes it's just about surviving long enough to fight another day." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. It was clear from the way he moved, the way he talked, that Bowmont had been doing this for a long time. He carried the kind of silence that comes from seeing too much, from facing horrors most people couldn't even imagine. And now, somehow, I was a part of it. Like I'd stumbled into a world that wasn't supposed to exist, a world I had no way of escaping. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my fingers twitching, as if they still held the cold weight of the silver blade. The room was dark, but not dark enough to hide the faint outlines of everything around me. The desk in the corner, the old baseball trophies gathering dust on the shelf, the faded posters on the wall, familiar things that should have brought me comfort. But they didn't. Not anymore. I listened to the sounds outside, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hum of a car passing by. Normal noises. But underneath it, there was something else. A silence, thick and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Like something was out there, watching. I hadn't slept well since that night by the tracks, and tonight wasn't any different. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again, those red eyes, glowing in the dark, hungry. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, the weight of its presence pressing down on me, smothering me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure if I'd ever sleep peacefully again. A week later, Bowmont decided it was time for something more. We met in the same run-down building, the stale smell of mildew clinging to the air. The flickering light overhead cast erratic shadows on the walls, and I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was ours, a sanctuary of sorts. Bowmont stood in the center of the room, his arms crossed, watching me as I entered. "We've covered the basics," he said, his voice steady. "But theory only gets you so far. You need to face something real." A chill ran through me at his words. I knew what he meant, but I wasn't ready. How could I be? I'd barely survived my first encounter with the hunger, and now he was talking about putting me up against something else? Something real? I hesitated, my voice catching in my throat. "Real?" Bowmont nodded. "There's something out in the woods. Small, but dangerous enough to be a threat. It's been feeding on wildlife, animals mostly, but that won't last. Eventually, it'll start looking for something bigger. People, maybe." I felt my chest tighten. "What is it?" "A wraith," he said simply. "Not as old or as powerful as the hunger, but it's still a killer. If you don't stop it, it'll only get worse." A wraith. The word sent a shiver down my spine. I'd read about them in the journal Bowmont had given me. A creature born from death and darkness, feeding on fear and life force. They weren't solid, not in the way most monsters were. They were shadows, specters that moved through the night, barely more than whispers of the dead. "How do you fight something you can't even touch?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Bowmont smiled grimly. "That's where the salt comes in. Salt's pure. It burns things like wraiths, things that don't belong in this world. And silver works on them too, if you can get close enough." The idea of going out there, into the woods, to face something like that, it terrified me. But the thought of doing nothing was worse. If I didn't act, if I didn't learn how to fight back, these things would keep coming. They wouldn't stop. And I wasn't sure I could live with that kind of fear hanging over me for the rest of my life. The night was darker than usual when we set out, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Bowmont led the way, his movements silent and purposeful, the faint glow of a lantern casting long, twisting shadows across the ground. I followed close behind, gripping the silver knife tightly in one hand, a small pouch of salt in the other. The woods felt different tonight. Every branch creaked, every leaf rustled, but underneath it all was that same suffocating silence, like the world was waiting for something to happen. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, the trees pressing in around us, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. I could feel the tension building, the weight of the hunt settling over us like a dark cloud. Bowmont had warned me that wraiths were tricky, hard to spot, harder to fight, but I hadn't expected the eerie stillness that accompanied them. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Bowmont stopped, his head tilted slightly, listening to something I couldn't hear. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, every muscle tensed. The air around us felt colder now, like the temperature. I saw it, a shadow, barely more than a wisp of darkness, but it moved with purpose. The Wraith. It slithered through the trees like smoke, its form shifting and undulating as it approached. My breath caught in my throat. How could I fight something that wasn't even solid? Bowmont raised his lantern, the light cutting through the fog just enough to reveal the Wraith's face. Or what passed for a face. It was hollow, empty, like the remnants of something long dead. Its eyes were pits of darkness, its mouth a gaping void. It let out a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the trees, and the air grew colder still. "Now," Bowmont whispered, his voice low and tense. "Throw the salt." My hands were shaking, but I did as he said, reaching into the pouch and flinging a handful of salt toward the Wraith. The moment the salt hit it, the Wraith let out a screech, its form recoiling violently, twisting and writhing as the salt burned it like acid. For a moment, it seemed to lose shape, the fog around it dissipating slightly. "Go for the heart," Bowmont shouted, his voice urgent. "The knife." I didn't hesitate. With the Wraith still writhing in pain, I lunged forward, driving the silver blade toward the center of its chest. The moment the knife made contact, the Wraith let out an ear-splitting scream, its body convulsing as the silver tore through it. The fog thickened around me, blinding me, and for a terrifying second, I thought I had lost it. But then the Wraith collapsed, its form dissolving into the mist, leaving nothing behind but a cold, empty silence. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the knife still clenched in my hand. Bowmont stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area carefully before nodding once. "Well done," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of pride. "You survived." Back at the building, I sat down on the old, splintered chair, my body still trembling from the adrenaline that hadn't yet drained. My hands, once tight around the silver knife, shook uncontrollably, and the cold sweat that clung to my skin felt more like a second layer of flesh. I'd just fought something that should not have existed, something that felt like it was made of nightmares and smoke. Mr. Bowmont, ever composed, poured me a glass of water from a tin pitcher on a nearby table, the clink of the glass breaking the heavy silence that had followed our return. He placed the water in front of me, and I reached for it, my hand still unsteady. I gulped it down, desperate for something to anchor me back to reality, but nothing could erase the memory of that thing's hollow, dark eyes, or the sound of its wail as the salt burned through its form. "You did well," Bowmont said, leaning against the edge of the table. His voice was calm, but I could sense the gravity beneath his words. "Better than most do their first time." "Most?" I rasped, my voice raw from the exhaustion. "How many don't make it?" His expression darkened for a brief moment before he regained his composure. "More than you'd want to know." I leaned back in the chair, my legs weak and my head swimming with the weight of what had just happened. I could still feel the cold of the wraith clinging to my bones, the sense that it had tried to pull something out of me, something deeper than just my life. I looked down at my hands, stained with salt and blood from where the knife had cut into my palm during the struggle. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice softer. "I fought it, killed it, but is it over?" Bowmont's gaze settled on me, his eyes filled with a kind of understanding I wasn't sure I wanted. "You've stepped into a world that doesn't stop. The creatures you're dealing with, they won't give up just because you've learned a few tricks. Each time you fight, it gets harder, and each time, they know you a little better." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't just survived tonight. I'd become something more, something marked. I knew deep down that the Wraith wasn't the last creature I'd face. It was only the beginning. "What about the hunger?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is it still out there?" Bowmont's eyes narrowed. "It is. The hunger doesn't forget its prey. But tonight, you've learned what it takes to fight back. And next time it comes for you, you'll be ready." The weight of those words sank deep into my chest, heavy and cold. I wasn't ready. Not really. But what choice did I have? The things that lived in the shadows had seen me now, and I couldn't hide from them forever. The next few weeks passed in a haze of training, nightmares, and constant vigilance. Bowmont drilled me relentlessly, pushing me to the edge of exhaustion, and then further. Every day, it felt like I was walking through quicksand, my mind still reeling from the fight with the Wraith, and the knowledge that the hunger was still out there, waiting for me. We went over the basics of protection, sigils, runes, and wards that could be used to keep lesser creatures at bay. I learned how to carve symbols into wood and stone, how to etch them into metal, and how to draw them in the dirt when time was short. But Bowmont made one thing clear: wards were only temporary. "These creatures, especially the old ones, aren't just mindless predators," he explained one afternoon, his hand steady as he drew a complex sigil on the ground. "They learn, they adapt. Wards can buy you time, but they won't save you in the long run. The only way to end it is to take the fight to them." I watched as he traced the lines in the dirt, the shape of the sigil slowly taking form. It was intricate, more than just a simple protection symbol. It was a barrier, a shield meant to keep something out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of symbols or salt could truly protect me from what was coming. 41. "Where do these things even come from?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "I mean, Wraiths. The hunger. Why are they here? Why are they after me?" Bowmont paused, his hand hovering over the sigil for a moment before he looked up at me. "Some of them have been here longer than we have. They're older than the forests, older than the earth itself. They're drawn to fear, to life, and sometimes to people who can see them." He straightened, wiping the dirt from his hands. "You stepped into their world the moment you crossed those tracks, and now they won't let you go."